A couple of days ago, a young trans girl ended her own life. And the general response for this was sympathy, regret even, that we couldn't do more to help her. And yet there is a subsection of people of whom we will deem the Protect Kids crowd that openly mocked her death, the tragic death of a child, from the Protect Kids crowd. Huh? I find it odd this crowd of people so desperately claim they want you to stay away from the kids, and yet will mock them very openly on a site that has increasingly become more tolerant towards evil. I'm, of course, talking about Twitter. So then, what gives? Why would a crowd that wants to protect children make literal memes about a child's suicide? Well, that's because they don't always actually want to protect kids. They just sometimes want to blindly push an anti-trans ideology for various reasons. But perhaps more importantly, I find it hard to believe they viewed this young trans girl as being, well, a person. For the others, I feel as if they're misled, and I hope this video may change their minds. I've covered my own gender identity here on the channel in other videos. This essay will not be that. Instead, I actually want to protect kids and the general trans community in what will perhaps be my most controversial video yet. Of course, I do not care if it is controversial, and while many of the Protect Kids crowd will probably say I'm just trying to more appeal towards my assumedly left-leaning audience, I promise this is not the case. Instead, these are all my own views, and ones that I came to after unlearning a lot of the bigoted beliefs I had previously held as a child and even a teenager. If you are trans, just know before we start, you are not evil. You, as most people are a gift to this world. I believe that every person should be able to live the life they want, as long as they're not harming others. And I feel as if this line of thinking, on the outside at least, is shared with the Protect Kids crowd. However, where we differ is that line, as long as they're not harming others. And for those that genuinely believe that being trans is harmful to one's own self, especially as a child, just know that I do understand where you're coming from. I disagree, and yeah, I hope to change your mind by the end of this video, but I do get it. I've been there. That being said, however, the general consensus among this crowd, from what I've seen and people I've personally talked to, is that I don't give a fuck if you're trans or gay, but keep that shit away from kids. Okay, let's work with that. Firstly, there's usually a small caveat thereof. I don't care, but just don't shove it in my face. And I must ask, what is being shoved in your face? Pride Month? Whatever happened to Straight Month? We have these dedicated time periods like Black History Month and Pride Month so that we may represent and celebrate underrepresented and historically marginalized and oppressed groups. We do it so we can change that, as imperfect as our methods may be. We do not need a straight month or a white history month, because those groups taken in isolation are not and were never oppressed solely based on the fact that they're black or that they were LGBTQ+. Especially in this country, sure, but even around the world. Yes, slavery and genocides have happened to straight white people. But importantly, this was not because they were straight or that they were white. That's the key difference here. Furthermore, you are not accepting of your trans friend if you do not support them fully being themselves out in public. Point blank. I genuinely don't care if you're chill with them, because a trans person will never truly be self-actualized if they're not able to express how they feel inside of a public setting. Self-acceptance is so great, so important. I understand that, but we ultimately live within a collective, one that has formed us. If we are not able to be ourselves out there, within that collective, I just find it hard to imagine that trans people will ever really feel like they are themselves. Of course, that's just what I think. And let's get into that for a minute. What causes someone to be transgender? And the answer to that, honestly, I'm not sure. There is science, real science behind it, but to my research, we just aren't sure at this time. At least, again, to my limited knowledge. I surely don't subscribe to the idea that a cultural change of acceptance is essentially forcing people to believe they're trans. But rather, I feel as if we are seeing more openly trans people because it is, even if only amongst certain demographics, becoming more acceptable. That people who have always been trans, they just weren't allowed to show it. Are the parents pushing it onto their children? Again, I just don't think so. While I'm sure there are a few bad apples out there that do this, to say that accepting your child and letting them express themselves how they want to is forcing them to be trans, well, I find that to be a bit ridiculous. If anything, not allowing them to do that is itself a form of forced identity. Parents should accept their children for who they are. They should love them for who they are. I'm not saying you have to immediately pay for a sex change operation when the kid is like 9 years old. I don't agree with that, and it's also not even happening literally anywhere, at least legally. But if a child born as a boy wants to, I don't know, paint their nails or wear a dress, for example, I just think that the parent should allow their kid to express that. Maybe they're not trans. Maybe they are. Maybe they're actually just going through a phase. But maybe they aren't. But the child needs to figure that out for themselves. And ridicule and yelling, or even just quiet repression of that expression, is only going to cause them avoidable pain. This does, of course, not necessarily mean that wearing a dress or painting your nails, even as an adult, means you're trans, gay, or LGBTQ+ at all. But I think you get my point. Okay, so the big one. Is being trans a mental illness? I've heard this tossed around quite a lot, and my research has concluded that no. Being transgender is not a mental illness. I don't expect the Protect Kids crowd to be convinced of that. I expect to see comments such as, well, the data has woke biases. And honestly, they could be right about that. I don't think they are, but there's still always that slight possibility. So instead, to convince you, I want to do a little thought experiment. And for this little thought experiment, we are going to make the false claim that to be trans is to have a mental illness. Okay? Okay. So then, I have only one question. What's the cure? They may say to convince them that they are their assigned at birth gender. But, Uncle Jimmy, how has that worked thus far? Are the abnormally high suicide rates amongst trans people proof that that method has been working? And Uncle Jimmy could then rebuttal with, well, it's the transness that makes them end their lives. And you see, I just don't agree with that. A game I covered on the channel recently, He Fucked the Girl Out of Me, goes a very long way in portraying a trans girl as facing immense trauma and pain. But that pain is really only caused by a lack of acceptance from her mother and presumably the rest of her family. This causes the main character, Anne, to try and find acceptance through other means. And I think this is emblematic of the general trans experience, although usually without the sex work stuff. A mental illness is deemed as such because of a psychological impact. And that psychological impact is oftentimes due to environmental factors. But being transgender does not innately make you depressed, unable to get out of bed. It does not innately make you hallucinate, afraid of what's behind you. Instead, high rates of mental diseases such as depression are prominent amongst trans people because of one thing: a lack of acceptance. A disillusionment of what they feel like they are versus what society tries to unjustly force upon them. Again, depression can come from a lot of things, but where the true rift in a person's identity starts is when they feel a certain way inside. And yet society will not accept them feeling that way. I at least believe that's where most of the pain of gender dysphoria comes in. And I'm not saying we can't question young trans kids in the line of, is this really what you want? But to tell them outright, this is not what you want, is just wrong. Like, seriously, kids aren't that stupid. They can do some level of critical thinking. So, is being trans akin to having a mental illness? No. But if it were, I at least think the easy solution here, the cure to the dysphoria, if you will, is just to accept them for who they are and how they feel inside. Sure, maybe they had a traumatic experience and that has led them to wanting to be someone else or a different gender. But as I told the friend recently, if that makes you finally comfortable and happy in your own skin, I just don't see a problem with it. And of course, there are so many trans people out there that have not had those traumatic experiences. We have to listen to them. Ah, yes. Now the argument of keep it away from children. And when the Protect Kids crowd says this, I think they are usually referring to sexual education. Now, for the sweet love of all that is holy, sex ed is not wrong. And I feel like many of the Protect Kids crowd see it as pornographic in nature. And like, what are we doing here, people? Sex ed is important for so many different reasons. I learned about it in 6th grade, which I feel is a pretty standard time to learn about these things, and also a good time, since your body typically undergoes puberty during that period of time. It's simply good to be educated when that happens, so you're not confused. Furthermore, it's important to learn about sex education so you know what to look out for in terms of things like SA. And when you're in high school or even middle school, you learn about having safe sex, so you can be protected from things like unwanted pregnancy and STDs. I don't really want to hammer this point home because I feel like I shouldn't even really have to, but there should be a standardized method of teaching about sexual education. Sure, the parents can and should teach their kids supplementary stuff as they see fit, but, well, I don't really believe in homeschooling. And as I hope I've made clear, sex education, super important. And when you're teaching sex ed, and this is the big point here, I legitimately don't see the harm in simply mentioning or explaining that some people aren't straight and that some people don't feel comfortable with their assigned at birth sex. Sure, you may say that these gender politics, as select people on Twitter have called it, will confuse the kiddos. But Uncle Jimmy, I promise you that if a kid was going to be confused about their gender identity, it was going to happen long before that, at least based on actual accounts from trans people. And if anything, teaching them that people do exist out there that are in a similar situation to them and have still found happiness and comfortability can quite literally save lives. And isn't that the point here? Again, I don't think that young children should be getting things like sex change surgeries, which, well, just isn't happening legally anywhere. And I'm not even completely sure which side I stand on when it comes to hormone blockers. But many credible sources say that the effects of the latter are reversible. And that if you take them to pause puberty developments, then if you simply decide to stop taking them, you'll resume puberty. I've heard many accounts of trans people say they knew as kids, and that hormone blockers could have saved them a lot of inner turmoil, or could have saved their lives. If you want to actually help kids, what you first have to do is listen to them. And at the very least, let them express themselves how they want to. But they'll get bullied, you say. But must we repress identity as opposed to trying and fix the wider bullying issue? Why should a trans, gay, non-binary, or gender fluid kid have to suffer because we don't want to try and end bullying? How about that? Hate and bigotry is something that is taught to kids. And if we put the proper education in place that teaches kids these people exist just like you, well, I think we'll go a long way to fixing the problem here. I mean it when I say that oppressing your gender identity, what you feel inside, is so much more painful than learning about trans people in sex ed. And I feel like that should be obvious, but I suppose it's not to some. I'm not saying my methods are perfect or that some parents won't force transition. But what you have to understand is that this stuff rarely ever happens. But Fox News won't tell you that. Trump and Vance won't tell you that. Because you've been fed an ideology, a myth of how things occur for your entire life. And they want to appeal to that side of you. But things just aren't happening like they say they are. And if you truly want to protect kids, you have to understand that any of the mental illness side that comes with being transgender is because of the hate of this world. The bigotry. It is the feeling that you can't be who you feel like you should be. That is what gender dysphoria is. And look, I know I've been throwing jabs out there in this video, calling you Uncle Jimmy, but I can sincerely understand where you're coming from. And through this video, I hope you'll think more about this stuff on a critical level. About how a lack of acceptance will damage or even end lives. And if you get anything out of this video, it should be this. Go talk to an actual trans person. Listen to what they say on a genuine level without any of your preconceived notions. It may just change your entire outlook on things. And for all the trans people out there, the youth included, just know that I see you. And I will fight for you. I will try to change this world simply because I wish we could have seen Charlotte smile again. Rest in peace. And, as always, thank you for watching.